Hello everyone and welcome back once again to a special Horror Month edition of ThursDev. I'm your host Luke, and this month we're getting into the spooky and macabre as we look at how we can make better horror games. Continuing along this year's theme, we're exploring the player's relationship with their character as regards to death, dying, pain, and suffering in horror games. Over the last two episodes, I was looking at the concept of player character death and how we can teach our players to fear, or at least feel a sense of unease about the character's death. It's a surprisingly difficult task when considering the disconnect that the player has to the character once they begin to realize that death is more of an inconvenience than a genuine threat. We also looked at how we can make our players learn to fear death by keeping death infrequent enough an occurrence that it retains its gravity through scarcity. But if we're creating fear of death by avoiding killing our players, how do we present a challenge? What else can we do to raise the stakes? I want to talk to you today about making your players suffer. That sounds worse than it is, but here's what I mean. Death, as we know it in the context of games especially, is something of a binary state. You are or you aren't most of the time. You can have died and started over, or you can die and be revived depending on the game, but ultimately, when death is on the table, it's an end state, so we have to treat it as one. I would argue, however, that when all you have to threaten your player with is death, your ability to keep your player threatened is going to be fairly weak. There must be some way that we can present more of a challenge, more of a threat to our players beyond just ending the game when they make too many mistakes. This is where I propose a strong look at the mechanics of fragility to further enhance the player's discomfort level. As humans, when we're injured, it makes our lives harder. Why not use this relatable, realistic mechanic to our advantage? Humans are fragile. We're afraid to get hurt because it hurts, and we know that pain often sustains beyond just the initial wound. The closest established term that I could find for this was on TV Tropes, which refers to it in one context as a break meter, but I feel that this doesn't quite do it justice. So I'm going to be calling it fragility mechanics for the purpose of this video. By fragility mechanics, I'm referring to mechanics that change the player's experience, frequently temporarily, in a negative way. Mechanics that deliberately make the game harder to play or more stressful, though ideally also in the context of the game and hopefully in a manner that the player has some way of mitigating, or can at least anticipate an end to, as a direct result of their failure in the game. This can be anything from negative effects of insanity as implemented in games like Amnesia: The Dark Descent or Eternal Darkness: Sanity's Requiem, which I went into at length during last year's Horror Month ThursDevs, to forcing your player to limp after they step in a bear trap or fall too far or run out of stamina, all mechanics that exist in the multiplayer asymmetrical horror game Friday the 13th, which we play frequently on our sister channel Level 0 NPCs. The heart and soul of the fragility mechanic is not only to show the player that they can die, but also that they're more mortal than the average game character, who is typically just fine until they die. In the vast majority of games, until you suffer from critical existence failure at some hit point threshold or for failing a QuickTime event, you're alive and functioning at top capacity. Fragility mechanics turn that trope on its ear by telling the player that damage has consequences. We can see an implementation of this to a lesser extent beyond the horror game in the implementation of fatigue. Too much running for a sustained period of time and the player is forced to walk, like in Dark Souls or Grand Theft Auto 5. Or how in Resident Evil the player would begin to limp and move more slowly when they took damage and had to make use of limited healing items to make themselves less of a sitting duck. In the ultra-realistic Arma series of military simulators, this is also used to great effect, broken limbs leading to impeded mobility, blood loss causing weakness, and in the case of the DayZ expansion, you can even catch a cold by swimming in the chilly ocean, which anecdotally led to one of the scariest experiences that I've had in a multiplayer game, as my sniffling was loud enough to alert other players to my location when I was scavenging a hospital looking for antibiotics, and the players I met there were none too friendly, let's say, as I watched the life drain out of me from a bullet hole in the chest. There have been many attempts to effectively impose fragility on a player in the past, but in the wrong place, it can just upset your players. The success of your fragility mechanics are very contingent on the game and on context. In general, they need to be used very sparingly, as actively impeding a player from playing to the best of their ability is an easy recipe for a poor play experience. Games like Bushido Blade were only able to get away with it, if not create a massive fanbase because of it, by marketing itself as a lethal sword fight simulator. In the context of the horror game, though, there's something of a mutual contract between the player and the developer that the empowerment of the average game will be taken away from them. Insanity and fragility mechanics are embraced by the horror game audience when done correctly because it contributes, as opposed to hinders, to the narrative of terror that you're giving to your players. They know that it's meant to be a demoralizing, disempowering experience, so they embrace it. A surprisingly strong and also surprisingly underused opportunity to make use of this comes from the infection of a zombie bite, as one finds in games like Contagion, which did a spectacular job of creating a sense of despair when you got bitten and knew that it was only a matter of time before you would be changed into a zombie and have to start killing your friends. This particular instance was a "you're doomed now" sort of moment, and due to its genre was acceptable if not fun for that very reason. But this is not to say, however, that you can take power from your players with impunity. The concepts of fragility mechanics are fairly simple, in theory, but in practice will be an exercise in finding that elusive sweet spot where you are by definition punishing your player, but not punishing them enough that they'll become frustrated. And they should also serve more purpose than just to make the player's life difficult. The malaria mechanic in Far Cry 2 was little more than a hassle for the player, and they had no way to avoid it in the first place. Your player will have to believe that your punishment is fair. Providing them with some way to remove their impediment, even if only temporarily, like a shot of morphine to get them moving normally for a while, or a leg brace, or allowing the player to treat that disease, is a good way to both help the player feel the situation is slightly more fair, while also affording the designer an opportunity to introduce another layer of resource scarcity, which is a staple of the horror game genre. Whatever your fragility mechanics manifest as, though, make them an integral part of your game if you want to create terror by doing so. Make it somewhat inevitable even. Only the most talented should be able to avoid it in its entirety, but helplessness is more delicious when the player has some agency that causes that helplessness. And helplessness is the feeling that you want to invoke here. Nothing is more frightening than being unable to do anything about something that is causing you pain, or the anticipation of knowing that something is going to happen that will affect you negatively. It's the bread and butter of the horror experience, and through this sort of manufactured helplessness, we can make our horror games that much better. But that's all that I have for today. I hope that you enjoyed this special Horror Month edition of ThursDev, and that you'll consider joining me again next week as well as I finish off this year's Horror Month ThursDevs with the anatomy of a video game jump scare. I hope that you'll drop by. Until then though, thank you as always for watching, and I hope that I'll get to see you here again very soon. Take care.